Although we discussed an important today in history moment yesterday, the June 28th Battle of Antioch, it's time for another. Campaigning season, summertime, is here, so get ready for lots of these today in history moments over the next 2 or 3 months. Okay, here we go. On June 29th, in the year 1236, the city of Cordoba, once the jewel of Muslim Spain and a symbol of Islamic dominance in Europe, was reclaimed by the Christian forces of King Ferdinand, or Fernando III of Castile, a man later canonized as a saint, not for piety alone, but, as we shall soon see, for acts of extraordinary valor in the crucible of holy war. 6 months earlier, in December of 1235, a daring band of Christians, led by a few knights, stormed and took a portion of Cordoba's eastern quarter. Word reached King Ferdinand in January of 1236, even as he was in mourning over the recent death of his 30-year-old wife from childbirth complications. The messenger implored him to come to the aid of the holed-up and vastly outnumbered Christians, who were separated from the Muslims clamoring for their blood by a thin wall. The king, who for years had been spearheading the reconquista, the Christian attempt to liberate Spain from Islam, was heavily moved by such a heroic feat, and the grief for the loss of his wife did not long suspend his warlike preparations, wrote a chronicler. On the same evening that the messenger arrived, Ferdinand's advisors strongly warned him against setting out now during winter. They cited impassable roads due to snow, rain, and floods, and possible ambushes from the innumerable multitude of Moors, they said. To say nothing of Ibn Hud, the de facto king of Al-Andalus, who was even then headed to Cordoba. But Ferdinand, quote, placed his hope in the Lord Jesus Christ and closed his ears to all such talk, continues the chronicler. He was resolved to aid his vassals, who had exposed themselves to such a great danger in his service and for the honor of the Christian faith. After sending word to his magnates in Castile and Leon to muster their forces, he set off for Cordoba on the very next morning, with only 100 knights. Despite the terrible road conditions, the 35-year-old king rode furiously through rain and sleet and reached the great Moorish city on February 7th. Ibn Hud had arrived before him with a much greater force, reportedly 35,000 Moors. But instead of waiting and meeting the Castilians, and perhaps because they had soundly defeated him a few years earlier at the Battle of Jerez in 1231, he unexpectedly withdrew back to Seville. As might be expected, the holed-up Christians burst in joy on seeing their king, this man who, quote, had exposed himself to much danger so that he could succor his people, continues the chronicler. After rescuing the daring band of Christians, Ferdinand laid siege to Cordoba. As Christian fighters continued to pour in from Leon, Castile, and Galicia, the noose tightened around the Muslim city. 5 months later, on today's date, June 29th, 1236, Cordoba, for centuries the ornament of the world, the ancient seat of Umayyad caliphs, and of course the Islamic world's chief emporium for white Christian slaves, surrendered to Ferdinand. Everyone had something to say about this grand event. Al-Makkari, the normally objective Arab historian, captured Muslim sentiment by bemoaning how, quote, that seat of the Western Caliphate, repository of the Muslim sciences, an abode of Islam, passed into the hands of the accursed Christians. May Allah destroy them all. For the indigenous Christians of Spain, however, the conquest, as with all conquests of the Reconquista, was the mere righting of a wrong. As the Latin chronicle relays, quote, the famous city of Cordoba, endowed with certain splendor and rich soil, which had been held captive for such a long time, that is, from the time of Rodrigo, the king of the Goths, who was killed in 711 at the Battle of Guadalete during the initial invasion of Spain, was restored to the Christian faith by the labor and valor of our king, Lord Ferdinand. Ferdinand granted lenient terms. Those Muslims who wanted to leave with all their movable possessions were provided safe passage. Those who wished to remain and practice their religion could do so. Either way, Ferdinand proceeded to repopulate Cordoba with, quote, new inhabitants, followers of Christ. Before entering and claiming kingship of Cordoba, Ferdinand ordered that the standard of the cross be carried before his own standard and placed on the highest minaret of the largest mosque, an event that, quote, caused ineffable confusion and lamentation among the Saracens and, on the other hand, ineffable joy among the Christians. Next, the great mosque of Cordoba, which Abdul Rahman I, a highly celebrated caliph among Western academics, built in the 8th century, after he had demolished and cannibalized the materials of St. Vincent's, an important 6th century Visigothic church, was, quote, cleansed of all filthiness of Muhammad, the Archbishop of Toledo wrote, and sprinkled with holy water and salt, so that what had once been the devil's lair was made a church of Jesus Christ. As I was saying, the Archbishop of Toledo wrote about how the church or the mosque was sprinkled with holy water and salt so that, quote, what had once been the devil's lair was made a church of Jesus Christ, end quote. Finally, Ferdinand found the bells of St. James Matamoros, the Moor slayer. They had been seized 250 years earlier by Muslim jihadists and sent to Cordoba on the backs of Christian slaves to adorn Cordoba's great mosque as trophies of war. Righting this ancient wrong, the king, who was well acquainted with the details of Muslim Christian history, had them returned to the shrine of Santiago, carried atop the backs of captive Muslim fighters, no less. Such was the reconquest of Cordoba, one of Christendom's greatest victories over Islam, and it occurred on this day in history. Bye.